Anything before the jury comes in? All right, if you bring the jury, please. There you are. Double check. All right, apparently we're waiting for a juror at this point. We've got a note from juror number 61 stating that she is rescheduling her mission trip and she wishes to remain on the jury. Yes, sir.
The issue with the jury that was looking for further funding, was the court able to address that?
Yes, he wasn't looking for further funding, but he was inquiring as to financial hardship that he might encounter at some point. But he indicated that he was able to work over weekends, particularly with our not having court this past Friday. He was going to work all weekend and that he'd be fine. Yes, sir. And you all can view the note from the juror who's opted to stay if you like. And we'll just be at ease waiting for the other juror. Here's this exhibit. Okay, all the jurors are here. I inquired of juror 234 whether she was aware of any social, personal, business, employment relationship that she had with any family member on either side, and she said she's unaware of any of the parties or she has no relationship with any family member on either side that she's aware of. She says she works for a company that employs over 300 people, and the only person she has recognized is the clerk of court, who she said was at a luncheon some years ago. So that's it for that particular juror.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. You'll bring the jury. Welcome back, everyone. You may call your next witness.
Defense calls William Vanderdoor. Okay.
Do you swear or affirm the testimony you shall give the court, the jury, and the trial in this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay. Please state your first and last name, and spell your last name loudly, clearly to the microphone.
William Vanadore, Vanadore.
Please, the court. Good morning, Mr. Vanderdoor.
Morning.
You are employed by SLED, is that correct?
That's correct.
Would you tell the jury a little bit about your background,
Okay.
and then tell the jury what you generally do?
For the last 11 years, I've worked as a forensic photographer at SLED. Prior to that, I was a professional photographer for 2 years and also a darkroom technician 3 years prior to that. I've received lots of on-the-job training, also multiple classes on digital imaging and forensics, including 2 in-service trainings at Quantico, Virginia, at the FBI Academy. Generally, what I do is I photograph evidence in a lab setting for other people to do their examinations. It's a non-destructive manner to document the evidence as it is.
Graduate of Lander College?
Lander University, yeah.
Sorry. And first time you've testified in court?
Correct.
The case involving Officer Slager of the North Charleston Police Department, are you familiar with that investigation?
Yes, sir.
Did you make any determinations independently of others when or what to photograph?
No, I was directed by whoever the case agent would have been to basically decide what to photograph, where to photograph. I didn't make any determinations like that.
Would it be fair to say that your position is one of following directions of others,
For the most part, yes.
and then turning whatever photographs you took over to others?
Yeah, the proper examiner.
So tell us a little bit, if you have your notes in front of you, what the time frame of the photographs were in terms of when did you use your camera, and about how many photographs you took each time.
Okay. Initially, we did some preliminary photographs on the 10th of November of last year, the 15. Then we did a further photography on the 30th of December, and then again on the 5th of January 2016. With those images, we did approximately, or actually we did exactly 880 total images that time. And then later on in January, on the 8th of January, and then on the 11th of January, we took further images. And at that point, we took 1,220 photographs, 1,220 photographs.
So in this case, you have taken over 2,000 photographs, is that fair?
That's correct.
And could you tell the members of the jury what you were photographing on those occasions?
I was basically instructed to look for anything that jumped out, any kind of fluorescence, any fiber, any blood evidence, just basically if anything jumped out in the photographs.
What were the objects that you were photographing?
Primarily item 34 and 35, which were Officer Slager's uniform shirt and his uniform pants.
Did you photograph anything else?
On the 11th, we also photographed item 37 and 39, which I believe was Mr. Scott's shirt and pants.
Did you ever photograph the taser?
Not the taser in question. I don't believe I photographed the taser.
Do you know if anyone at SLED ever photographed the taser?
Possibly Agent James Talon.
And is that the same James Talon, if you know, who testified to the jury last week?
It is.
And would you tell us the difference between what you do and Mr. Talon does?
Okay. Agent Talon primarily does photographs on scene as they're collecting other evidence, basically doing the whole documentation of the scene, whereas mine is more for examination purposes, usually not for documentation. Usually it's specific items, whether it be latent impressions, fibers, so forth, for them to do their further examination.
And would your records reflect, or do you have personal knowledge of whether any photographs were taken by SLED or one of its contractors before the Taser was sent to Scottsdale, Arizona?
I have no knowledge of that.
Would you kindly answer any questions the prosecution may have?
Okay.
No questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Defense calls Megan Fletcher.
Do you swear affirm the testimony you shall give the court and the jury in the trial of this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
My name is Megan Fletcher, Fletcher.
Morning.
Good morning.
I understand you're employed by the State Law Enforcement Division,
Yes, sir, I am.
and that is in Columbia.
Yes, sir.
You kindly tell the jury your background that led to your position at SLED.
I have a bachelor's degree in biochemistry and English from Chatham College in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I also have a master's degree in forensic science, emphasizing in computer forensics and forensic chemistry from Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. And I've been employed at SLED in the forensics laboratory in the trace evidence department since October of 2007.
Could you tell us what trace examiners do?
Well, at SLED, trace examiners perform a number of different analyses, and these analyses include gunshot residue analysis, fire debris, paint, fibers, explosives, pressure-sensitive tapes like duct tape, bank dye analysis, and general chemical and physical unknowns.
And the purpose of what you do is what? Why do you do what you do?
We perform examinations in order to answer a question. Basically, was there gunshot residue present? Does a fiber match another fiber?
And that is to educate the jury to the best of your ability on evidentiary matters. Is that correct?
We perform analyses to help aid in an investigation.
Now, were you asked to become involved in the case involving Officer Slager?
Yes, sir, I was.
And I understand that some of your colleagues were also asked to be involved,
Yes, sir.
and that one of them is currently of ill health and on leave. Is that correct?
She is on FMLA.
And as a result of that, your testimony today will substitute for her testimony.
Correct, sir. I was the technical reviewer of her analyses.
And that would include the evaluation of gunshot residue. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, it was.
If you would tell the jury the background of what gunshot residue is, what is the evidentiary value of that? For what purpose do you do your examinations on gunshot residue? Why do you do that aspect of your work?
Gunshot residue is everything that comes out of a gun when it's fired. When we say gunshot residue at the SLED lab, we're specifically referring to the primer residue. The primer residue is composed of 3 main components, and of those components, we're looking for lead, barium, and antimony. Those are 3 very heavy elements. When those elements are found in combination with one another in a specific morphology, which is molten and a discrete particle, we can say that gunshot residue was found. When we say gunshot residue is found, it can mean any one of 3 things. Either somebody fired a weapon, was in the vicinity to the discharge of a weapon when it was fired, or handled something that already had gunshot residue on it.
And when you use words like morphology or whatever the long word is, would you break that down for us?
Morphology basically refers to the shape of a particle. So we're looking at a roundish particle or something that looks like it was subjected to a high heat.
And those particles are found in the environment that probably be in this courtroom?
Gunshot residue particles, those containing lead, barium, and antimony, and have that molten morphology, are specific to gunshot residue or primer residue.
So the combination and the condition is what's specific to gunshot residue,
Correct. The 3 elements must be present, and they must have a specific shape.
but the basic elements are available in the environment.
Lead, barium, and antimony to an extent can be found in the environment, but especially lead and antimony, there are controls for environmental purposes that they're not as ubiquitous.
So if the procedure of collection is appropriate and they have not been interfered with, that is a pretty scientific analysis of what that contents is. Is that fair to say?
Correct. We can analyze a particle lift that was collected from an individual's hands, and if we find those particles on it, then we can say that gunshot residue was present.
And that's what your academic background, your training, your experience at SLED has led you to become an expert in that. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, we propose that this witness be an expert in gunshot residue interpretation.
Says the state. Okay, she's so qualified.
With respect to the gunshot residue involved in the case before the court, would you tell us the sources of the evidence collection?
There were 2 gunshot residue kits collected. One was collected from Officer Michael Slager, and the other was collected from Walter Scott. A gunshot residue kit consists of 4 particle lifts, which are, they look like stamps with a sticky surface on it. And there's one collected from the right palm of a hand, the right back of a hand, the left palm of a hand, and the left back of a hand.
And when were they collected, and do you know anything about how they were collected, or did you just receive that information?
May I refer to my notes? According to the gunshot residue analysis information form that's included in gunshot residue kits for an officer or an investigator to fill out, the gunshot residue kit from Officer Michael Slager was collected on April 4th, 2015 at 12:54 p.m. In regards to the GSR kit from Walter Scott, it was collected on April 5th, 2015 at 9:45 a.m.
The one in Officer Slager, could you give that to us one more time, please?
I'm sorry?
The date of Officer Slager's?
April 4th, 2015.
And do you know where the location of the collection?
No, sir, I do not.
With respect to the analysis, would you have the dates that you performed the analysis of those, of that evidence?
The gunshot residue kit from Walter Scott would have been analyzed on pardon me. April 9th, 2015.
And you supervised that or peer reviewed the evidence that another lab scientist evaluated, is that correct?
Yes, yes, sir. Another analyst in the lab actually took custody of this evidence, analyzed it on the instrument, and then once she wrote up the case, meaning she came to her own conclusions and created a draft report, I then went through the entire case and came to my own conclusions, examining each page of the data to make sure that the data supported the conclusions drawn, and then I signed off on the report.
And so you agree with the first scientist who evaluated it?
Yes, sir.
And that is the scientist who's not available today due to illness?
Correct, sir.
And would you tell the jury, please, what the findings that she made as well as the findings you confirmed are with respect to Mr. Scott?
In the GSR kit collected from Walter Scott, particles of gunshot residue were found on his right hand. That includes the right palm and the right back of his hand. On his left hand, 1 particle of gunshot residue and 1 particle consistent with gunshot residue was found.
And was there anything in those 4 areas that were examined found to be negative?
There was one area. Walter Scott's left palm did not contain any particles characteristic or gunshot residue, particles consistent, or particles associated with gunshot residue.
And in terms of describing right and left, I know this seems elementary, but would it be the person's right palm, or would it be looking at the person's right palm? If I raise my hands in terms of your description of the location, using my body, it's my right hand?
It's the individual's right hand.
So right palm would be the surface that I'm pointing at you now,
Yes, sir.
and the back would be the surface I'm pointing at you now.
Yes, sir.
And with the left hand, likewise, the palm is facing you, the back of the hand.
Correct, sir.
And it was the left palm that was negative.
Yes, sir.
Now, what could the reasons for that be?
There's a number of different reasons for an area being negative. With a deceased individual, there's no activity, so some of those reasons could be washing of the hands by medical personnel. There could have been blood covering the hand. There also could have been an intervening object that prevented the deposition of gunshot residue.
The last deposition of gunshot residue, you mean gunshot residue wouldn't have gotten on his hand because something was in his hand?
That's a possible reason.
Now, how, you had given us earlier the possibilities of how gunshot residue would be found. And could you go through those 3 descriptions you had given us earlier?
Yes, sir. You can get gunshot residue on your hands from firing a weapon.
And what would be the timing of that?
We have a 6-hour time frame for a living person in which we can identify gunshot residue and tie it back to a specific incident.
And a second?
It would be being in the vicinity to a gunshot, the firing of a weapon. That would include being a victim of a gunshot wound.
And the third?
That would be touching something that has gunshot residue on it, or somebody touching another object and transferring that gunshot residue.
Is this called secondary transfer?
Yes, sir, we can call it that.
So if I had gunshot residue in my hands, I could touch somebody else and deposit portions of the gunshot residue on my hands.
Yes, sir.
Supposing I was a police officer who had a duty belt with a firearm on it,
Okay.
and that the firearm had been used at, say, a shooting range or a qualification range or whatever, is that a possibility?
If there was gunshot residue on a belt or on any of those objects, it has the possibility being transferred if somebody else touches it.
Now, in this case, did you have an opportunity to examine forensically the gunshot residue on Mr. Scott's cell phone?
No, sir, the cell phone was not analyzed for the presence of gunshot residue.
Did you have an opportunity to analyze the gunshot residue on Officer Slager's duty belt
No, sir.
or any of the items on his duty belt?
No, sir.
Going back to the general nature of your job, if an item of evidence is submitted to the lab, can multiple examinations be done in trace labs?
It depends on the type of analysis, but in certain circumstances, it can be done.
And should that be done sequentially, one after another?
It would depend on, again, the type of evidence, what was being requested of that, and we would have to determine which order to perform those analyses in.
Let's say that there was a taser or any type of a weapon. And is there an examination of a taser that you could do in trace analysis?
It would depend on what type of evidence that somebody was looking for on that type of taser. If it's one of the categories of testing that a trace examiner performs, then yes, we could examine that.
So let's go through those. You could examine it for gunshot residue.
We could,
You could examine it for paint.
yes, sir.
And was there paint found on the taser that Officer Slager used on April 4th?
It's my knowledge that there was yellow material found on the taser. However, I have not confirmed that there was paint on the taser.
And did SLED have an exemplar of that yellow material?
A standard of the yellow material?
Yes.
No, sir, we did not.
Did you have a exemplar of the material that was found on the taser?
We did have in our possession at one point the yellow material removed from the taser.
Did anybody collect, I forget the term you used, but I would assume the yellow paint from the yellow brick road?
A standard of paint from the road? Not to my knowledge.
So that a comparison was not possible?
A comparison between the yellow road and what was on the taser would not have been possible except if a standard was collected.
And did any of the crime scene people or the field agents, I know that's not the proper term, but not the lab people, the other people at SLED, ever collect that
Not to my knowledge.
for purposes of scientific examination that could have been done today?
I'm sorry?
For purposes of your scientific examination, comparing the chemical components that was found on the yellow material on the taser to the chemical components of yellow brick road, that could be done today if it was collected?
If a comparison was requested, it could be done to compare a standard from the road and whatever was collected off of the taser.
If there was yellow markings on Mr. Scott's cell phone, could the same thing be done by the SLED laboratory?
Yes, sir.
Do you know whether you were ever requested or anyone else was requested to examine the cell phone to take evidence of yellow material?
I was never requested.
But if you had been requested and somebody had the yellow material from Yellow Brick Road, that could be done.
That is an analysis that I can perform.
Were you ever asked to look at the cell phone to do a glass analysis to see whether it was damaged and what type of damage it had?
Glass analysis for us would have been a glass comparison, so I wouldn't have been able to do any analysis on the type of damage that occurred on it.
But certainly you could document the damage.
I could document that something was broken or not intact.
And you could also document the location in which the pressure came from to damage the cell phone glass.
I could say which area of the cell phone there was damage.
And you could then compare that to the yellow markings on the cell phone.
I could say that there was yellow markings in an area of damage, but I wouldn't be able to say that they happened at the same time.
With respect to fibers, would you tell the jury, give us a little of that CSI talk about fibers and what they are, where they come from, how you analyze them, how you collect them?
So fibers make up everything that you wear. They are elongated polymers in some cases, or elongated vegetable fibers such as cotton. What we do with them is we look at them underneath a microscope or use other instrumentation to identify what type of fiber they are, whether it be cotton or polyester. And then we can perform a comparison between the two. And the comparison entails, are they the same type? Do they have the same size and shape? Are they the same color? And we collect those by either tweezing them off of a given object, or we can use a piece of water-soluble tape to collect unknown fibers. And then for standards, we would actually remove pieces from an article of clothing to collect our standards.
And transfer of fibers and the examination of those fibers is a standard scientific based test that you do at Slager, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And can those tests be done through photography?
There is a certain aspect of a fiber examination where you can take pictures to document your findings. Yes, sir.
And is it fair to say that photography is important to establish at a specific time that evidence existed or did not exist?
Photography can be used to document when something was in existence. However, case notes can also allow for that. It doesn't have to be photographed.
Do you know from your experience or from your case file whether or not the taser of Officer Slager was photographed or examined by you or your colleagues before it was transferred to Scottsdale, Arizona for examination?
I did not perform any analysis on the taser prior to that.
From your case notes, do you know whether anybody else performed an examination?
I wouldn't know that from my case notes. I don't have firsthand knowledge of that.
Do you know whether the taser was photographed before it went to Scottsdale?
I don't have knowledge of that.
Do you know whether the taser was photographed at Scottsdale, at Taser International?
Yes, sir, I have seen those images.
And would you tell the jury the quality of those images for scientific purposes?
Those images appeared to be more inventory images, not to document any trace features on them per se, but just to document the general condition of the taser.
And do you know what type of experiments were performed at Scottsdale?
No, sir, I do not.
Do you know that after the taser was returned to SLED, whether photographs were taken at that time?
I have no knowledge of that.
Now, with respect to, I think everybody refers to it as 34 and 35, but that is the clothing worn by Officer Slager?
Yes,
Is that
sir, it
correct?
was the uniform.
And you had, at some point in time, possession of that, correct?
Yes, sir.
Could you refer to your notes and tell us when you received that and when you started examining, particularly 34, that would be the shirt of Mr. Slager?
Yes, sir. I began my analysis on August 4th, 2016.
And how many analysis did you do between 2000, August 4th, 2016 or 15?
August 4th, 2016.
And was that as a result of a request from the solicitor?
That was a request from the solicitor's office to perform a comparison between an unknown fiber removed from the taser and compare it to Officer Slager's clothing as well as Walter Scott's clothing.
And when did you first get those items in your possession, the exemplars?
The item 34,
You were doing a comparison of something to something else.
I was performing a comparison between Officer Slager's uniform, which was 100% polyester, to an unknown fiber removed from the taser by WD Forensics and Microvision Northwest in Seattle, Washington.
Would that be Mr. Schneck?
Yes, sir.
And you were present when that fiber was removed?
Yes, sir.
And that would have been at what time?
February 10th of 2016.
And the comparison was done 6 months later?
Yes, sir.
And the comparison findings were what?
I found that the unknown fiber removed from the taser did not match item 34, Officer Slager's uniform shirt, item 35, Officer Slager's uniform pants, or Walter Scott's pants.
And that was done in August of this year?
Yes, sir.
And the firing of the taser was done by Taser International in Scottsdale in October of last year. Is that correct?
I don't know when that was performed.
But there was no removal of fibers or examination of fibers before the Scottsdale evaluation of the taser?
No, sir.
And do you know whether the taser was fired? That is, whether an electrical test was done at Scottsdale?
I'm not aware of
Do you
what
know?
was performed.
Do you know what evidence was or may have been destroyed by that experimentation?
No, sir, I do not.
Now, that was in August of this year. What other experiments did you conduct?
I also performed an analysis on item 34, Officer Slager's shirt, in October of this year.
And did you take or have Mr. Vanador take photographs of that?
No, sir, I did not have Mr. Vanador take any photographs.
Did you take any photographs of what you did?
Yes, sir, I did.
Tell us what your research in preparing for your examination of Officer Slager's shirt entailed.
An exemplar uniform shirt was obtained from North Charleston PD.
If you would, sometimes I even get confused. If you could tell us what exemplar, we use that term a lot, but I want the jury to have a good understanding of exactly what was compared to what.
It was a uniform shirt that was the same name brand, the same 100% polyester composition. It's a shirt that we can perform a test on.
And for what purpose?
The purpose of these particular tests was to determine whether it was possible to find evidence of a drive stun event from a taser.
And when were these, when did you start conducting your experiments?
I believe it was February 19th, 2016.
And how many experiments did you do? What type of experiments did you conduct? And did you issue a report of that?
So there was an experiment done in the lab because there's no known literature as to what damage is caused by a drive stun event using a taser. We had two shirts. We had the test uniform shirt composed of 100% polyester. We also had a white 100% cotton t-shirt. In each of these tests, we performed a number of different drive stun events at intervals of 1 second, 2 second, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30. And each one of those was done once with the cartridge on the taser and once with the cartridge off of the taser. I then looked at those different shirts underneath a microscope to observe what type of damage to these fibers was present.
Prior to doing those experiments, did you conduct any research?
I did a literature review to try to determine whether there was any research out there regarding the damage caused by a drive stun event, and I could not find any.
Did you find that there had been, in your research, evaluations of heat and its effect on fabrics?
There is documented evidence about what heat will do to different types of fibers.
And do you have with you the photographs of your research?
Yes, sir.
And do you have them with you?
I have them in my case file.
May I take a look at them?
Sure. This one right here.
I want to show you Defense Exhibit 55 and Defendant's Exhibit 56.
All right. Defendant's Exhibit 56 is an image of the book that I used to determine what characteristics would be present in different damages to polyester fibers. This,
If you could, just a moment.
Sure.
The Honor would offer this as Defendant's Evidence 56.
Any objection? It's admitted.
On the second page of this exhibit, there is an image marked as 3, which shows a polyester fiber that has undergone a temperature greater than its melting point, which is quite high. It's greater than 480 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that is one of the images that I use to help make my determinations.
And then if you would explain to the jury what 55 is.
Exhibit 55 are photographs that I obtained using my microscope of different areas of item 34, Officer Slager's uniform shirt, specifically on the left side of the left pocket, showing fibers that have undergone melting at some point. So they show an elongated fiber with a rounded end, a bulbous end that almost looks like you're blowing glass or blowing up a balloon.
All right, let's start with 56, if we could show that, please. In your research, this is some of the material you looked at, is that correct?
Yes, sir, it is.
And that's a peer-reviewed publication.
It's a textbook.
And would you show us then on the interior of the textbook exactly what you were looking for and why you were looking for it?
Can I stand up, please?
Pardon me?
May I stand up?
What? Yes, I'm sorry. Do you need a pointer?
Image 3.
Can you hold on just a second?
Image 3 here shows an elongated fiber on the end, and it starts to get more rounded and more rounded until it becomes almost circular at the very top, and that's characteristic of a polyester fiber.
So that's not visible to the naked eye, is that
No,
correct?
sir, it would not be.
And tell the jury in this textbook how they would have evaluated that fiber. What tools would they use to evaluate it?
I believe they used a process called scanning electron microscopy, but it's just another tool to take an image of a fiber at close range.
Have a seat if you like. And so, as I understand it, when this shirt came to you, that there hasn't been a whole lot of actual Taser derivative fabric examination. That a a taser was used to do that.
I could find no literature on the use of a taser and identifying those marks on clothing.
But in your evaluation of Officer Slager's shirt, you used instruments that are approved for fabric examination.
Yes, sir, I used a stereo microscope, which is routinely used in the examination of fibers.
So while the examination of the cause, that is the taser, that was unusual, but the methodology in which you used the scientific principles employed and the scientific process is well established.
Correct, sir. I am able to determine the extent of the damage to a fiber.
Would you then show the photographs, I guess, that you took? Is that-
Yes, sir.
Tell us how that works.
Basically, I have a microscope with a camera attached to it, so it sees the same thing that I'm looking at. And then that camera actually has the ability to take any number of pictures in a vertical fashion. So you can take a picture here, and it'll go up a little bit, and take another picture right above it, and so on and so forth. And it can take up to, for anywhere from 100 images to 1,500 images, just depending on how many you need. I was then able to look at each individual frame and pull out pictures of fibers that showed characteristics of having once been melted.
And would you show us those images, please?
Yes, sir, they're in Exhibit 55.
So we'll go through, hopefully in the same order that you have them, if you can point out to the jury what was significant about your findings.
So in these two fibers here, you can see the elongation and then the rounded bulbous end to it. And in this image, you see the same thing with this fiber.
Could you tell us how many times, that's not with the naked eye, correct?
No, sir, that is, I don't have the exact magnification. It's probably around 80 times magnification.
The meaning of what you found there is that these fibers were disturbed by what?
These fibers had undergone some sort of high temperature greater than the melting point of polyester. As I said before, that's greater than 480 degrees Fahrenheit.
And could you show us some of your other work product, please?
Sure.
Page 2. Mr. Ackerman?
Again, that's the same picture, just showing a different, I showed both of them to you the first time. This is, again, showing the same two fibers.
And the next?
This here is a little bit of a different one. It shows melting from this point all the way up to this point. And on this fiber, it shows melting from here to here. And as well as an elongated fiber with the rounded end up there at the top.
Next?
Again, you see this elongated going into the rounded bulbous end of this melted fiber with similar characteristics on this area.
And next?
These are melted, damaged fibers in this area and this area.
And next?
You have a melted fiber here with that round bulbous end, as well as two fibers, or at least one fiber that's come together in a loop, forming a melted portion of that fiber.
And I would assume that there are many other pictures that
There
would
are, sir.
be the same type of thing for the jury to view.
Yes, sir.
Now, if you would return to your seat and be comfortable.
Okay.
Whereabouts on the shirt itself, again, using my body, if you will, on the right side, using my right hand, or left hand and on the left side? Where was that damage found?
It was found on the left pocket.
And did you find anything else on the left pocket that would be significant on or in the left pocket for the jury to know?
I found numerous damaged fibers. I did not find any holes or any other damage to that extent. I found individual fibers with damage to them.
And how about inside the pocket? Did you find anything there?
I did not perform any analysis inside the pocket.
Did you find any dirt in the pocket?
There was an area of light brown material I'm not qualified or, according to my laboratory or my training, to identify it positively as soil, but there was an area that had a physical appearance that's consistent with sand or soil.
And again, there was no, what you call it, an exemplar from the yellow brick road to compare it chemically or compare it granularly to that material?
That is not something that our laboratory is capable of performing.
But the question though, was there any sample taken that could be compared?
Well, in this case, there wouldn't have been one because it's not a category of testing that our laboratory is accredited to perform an analysis in.
But it would be significant for the jury to know if there was dirt in the pocket.
I would have no knowledge of that.
Now, when was the report issued of your findings?
I'm sorry, the comparison findings or
Comparison
the
findings of the fiber, I call them disruptions, what is it?
the damage to the
The
fibers?
damage to the fiber.
That report was issued October 20th, 2016.
So that was 11 days before the trial started, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And in that report, did you find that compared to your other testing on the shirt from North Charleston, polyester shirt, and Officer Slager's shirt, that there was consistency with the use of a taser causing those damages?
In the test shirt, I found a few areas which also contain melted fibers. I found that the taser was capable of melting fibers. On the evidence shirt, item 34, I was not able to rule out a taser as a possible source of having created those melted fibers.
And again, the heat involved in this would be 480 degrees.
Roughly, sir.
So did you look for other items that we all deal with that could have caused those other than a taser?
I also examined an iron and what kind of damage it might possibly do. Even at its highest setting, it was not capable of melting the polyester fibers. I also examined the use of a flame to make a pick disappear. It's sometimes used on synthetic fabrics when you have a pick or protruding fibers from a garment. And the damage caused by that flame didn't melt the fibers, but it also caused a change in color, at least in the couple of experiments I tried with that.
So in everyday use, an iron doesn't have the heat capable of making that change,
No, sir.
and an iron at high temperature would cause discoloration of the fabric, is that correct?
A flame, when a flame is held up against a pick of fibers, that causes a discoloration in the fibers.
And none of that was found?
No,
at
sir.
Officer Slager. And I assume from the moment you made these findings that you've racked your brain to think what else other than a taser could cause it. Is that fair to say?
I have tried to determine whether another source could be possible. I'm not aware of any other source that can create that heat, but I'm definitely not going to rule out another source.
Because there's always a possibility that he was on the beach, laying down on the beach with a magnifying glass on his chest that could have caused it.
I don't know what heat that would actually produce, so I couldn't say that.
But I mean, you're well experienced in fiber analysis, fabric analysis, and you've thought for weeks now, if not months, what else there could be, and there's always that potential of a meteor landing on the Earth.
Objection, Your Honor, leading.
Can you think of any other rational, worldly explanation for this damage?
I don't have an opinion on that.
Just one moment, please.
Sure.
made this report, you base that on your academic, your master's degree, your research in the subject area, your knowledge, the general knowledge of fabrics and fibers and whatnot. And you employed scientific methods to establish this, is that correct?
Yes, sir. I used valid scientific methods to determine the extent of damage to fabrics, which is something that a fiber examiner does.
And what area of expertise does one call themselves who does what you do?
I perform analyses in the field of fibers.
Analyses in the field of fibers?
A fiber analyst, forensic fiber analyst.
We would offer this witness as an expert witness in the field of fiber analysis.
State.
So qualified.
I'll answer your questions as a prosecutor.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Court's indulgence, if I may, Mark. Exhibit ready. Ms. Fletcher, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing well. If I could, I'd like to just review some of the things that Mr. Savage spoke with you about.
Okay.
And I'd like to begin, please, with the with GSR, gunshot residue.
Okay.
You did identify for the jury, I just want to make sure that this is clear to them, several sources where a person could get gunshot residue on their hands.
Yes, sir.
One, clearly the firing of a weapon.
Yes.
Would you expect as an expert in this field to find a large quantity of GSR on someone who actually fired a weapon?
GSR is not a quantitative science, it's a qualitative, which means that we're looking for the presence or absence of it, not how much is there.
Okay. But do you nevertheless note sometimes in your report how much you find?
We determine how many particles that we are looking at and actually identify gunshot residue particles, yes.
Okay. And in this case, ultimately, the GSR evidence on Officer Slager was not analyzed, is that correct?
No, sir, it was analyzed.
Okay. And GSR was found?
On his right hand it was.
Okay. On Officer Slager's radio?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Another way a person may have gunshot residue on their hands is being in proximity to firing a weapon, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What about being actually shot with a weapon?
Yes, sir, the proximity includes being the victim of a gunshot wound.
Okay. And are you familiar with the study done by a Robert Gerard?
I would have to be able to see the study.
Are you familiar with any studies that might give some sort of distance or proximity as to where you could get?
I have seen a study that states that gunshot residue can travel as far as 18 meters.
And do you know if 18 meters would translate into 59 feet?
Roughly, yes.
Also, if you could explain to the jury again this idea of evidence transfer.
Okay.
How does that work?
So in regards to gunshot residue or fiber?
Gunshot residue.
Evidence transfer for gunshot residue can occur when one object or one person has gunshot residue on it, and then it's transferred to another person. So a handshake would transfer gunshot residue. If somebody picked up a gun that had gunshot residue on it, they would get it on their hands. It's just the transfer of one particle to another object or person.
Now, we talk about ways that gunshot residue can happen, but does that mean, is that always the way it happens? I mean, could I be the victim of a gunshot and still not have it on some part of my hand?
Yes, sir.
Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean someone's holding something or not holding something. That could just sort of happen randomly at times? Is that
Yes,
right?
sir.
Okay. And so, Ms. Fletcher, knowing what you know about this case, have you seen the video in this case?
Not for a very long time.
Have you you seen it at all?
Probably a year or so ago.
Okay. Well, how about like this? Would you expect to find GSR on the hands of a person who was shot within that 18 meters?
In a catalog of different cases that we've done in our laboratory where we have analyzed victim GSR kits, we found that in over 75% of the cases, the victim was positive for gunshot residue in at least one area.
And would you also find it very possible or probable that a person who fired a gun several times and then went and handled a victim's hands could transfer that GSR to the hands?
Transfer could happen in that scenario, yes.
Okay, so in no way, in those situations, in no way would the presence of GSR suggest to you that that person necessarily possessed a gun earlier that day?
No, sir.
Or fired a weapon earlier that day?
No, sir.
Mr. Savage asked you about sequential testings of items. You're a trace evidence expert, correct?
Yes, sir.
If we were talking about the ability to get, say, fingerprints and DNA from an evidence item, would it be better to talk to the DNA expert and the fingerprint expert?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And they could offer a good answer?
They should be able to.
Okay. Ms. Fletcher, I'd like to move on to the first, well, actually, Mr. Savage asked you several times about whether or not yellow paint was analyzed. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
And your answer to those questions were?
We did not analyze any yellow paint in our laboratory.
Okay. Let me ask you, as a fiber expert, are there carpet fibers? Is that something that might contain fibers?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I don't know if you see this in the corner, but do you realize that we're on video right now?
I believe so.
So if I rub this phone on that carpet right there,
Okay,
and it was captured on video, okay,
okay.
and done in front of all these jurors, would there be a point of testing this phone for blue carpet fibers?
Well, it would
A
de-
probative point, if that was in question.
It ultimately comes back to what question are you trying to ask? When something is known to have come in contact with another source, that's not when trace evidence is most probative.
Okay, so if we watched a video all together of a taser skidding down the yellow painted road, would we need to answer the question of whether or not that taser came in contact with yellow paint?
Well, ultimately, that would be an investigator or somebody else's decision, but it would not, according to our laboratory, be as probative because it's already been established to be at the scene.
Okay, and if we heard or saw and heard that a phone had fallen on that yellow paint, would there be a probative purpose of having you identify the yellow paint on the phone as from the yellow brick road?
If it was already picked up at the scene, it's already been placed there, and the addition of paint analysis would not add any additional value.
And are these the type of determinations in any case that investigators and forensic personnel such as yourself have to make, what gets done and not done?
Yes, sir.
Because it's rather easy later on, correct, to come around and say, well, this suggests that you didn't do everything you could. Have you found that to be true?
I guess so, yes.
I'd like to move on now to you took a trip to Seattle, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that was to meet with some other experts in your field, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall the names of the people you met with?
William Schneck was the trace evidence expert that I met with. And I believe Rick Wyant was an expert more on the taser side as opposed to the trace side.
And what was the purpose of traveling out to Seattle?
When the taser was sent to WD Forensics in Seattle, an unknown fiber was observed by Mr. Wyant, I believed. And so experts were called in from both sides to remove and observe this fiber.
Okay. And were you there, did you observe that being removed?
I did.
Did you have an opportunity on that trip to sort of speak with and talk to Mr. Wyant and Mr. Scheck?
They were present while I was there, and we all observed the removal of the fiber together.
Okay. Do you have any familiarity with Mr. Wyant and Mr. Scheck's? Are they generally accepted as experts also in your field?
I do believe Mr. Schneck is accepted. I'm not as familiar with Mr. Wyant.
Okay. And that's the same field as you, correct?
Mr. Schneck is, yes.
What about a Mr. Paluccio? Did you have an opportunity to meet him?
I've never met him, no.
Okay. But to practice in your field and offer opinions in your field, would you expect one to have a similar background as you, education-wise?
They usually have similar training experience in the field of trace evidence.
Okay. Did you later have an opportunity, we've heard the phrase, the business end of a taser. Is that a good description of where this fiber was taken from?
It was collected from one of the terminals. I'd have to refer to my notes to say which terminal.
Okay, when you refer to terminals, I'm handing you what's been marked as Interstates 49. This doesn't have a battery in it.
Okay.
Could you show the jury what you mean by one of the terminals?
It's my understanding, again, I'm not a taser expert, but each of these metal areas on the front end of this is considered a terminal.
Okay, so there was a fiber removed from one of these.
Yes, sir.
Did it match the uniform shirt of Officer Slager?
No, it did not.
Ms. Fletcher, if we can move on, again, I don't think this was described in great detail. Could you talk again about what was done with this exemplar shirt that you found, that you obtained from North Charleston?
So with the exemplar shirt, it was drive stunned for different time intervals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30 seconds. It was done with the cartridge on, without the cartridge, and how it was performed was I would look at the taser to begin with to determine or make sure that there was no extraneous material such as fibers present on the taser to begin with. The shirt would be drive stunned. I would take the taser back. I'd look under my microscope and see if there were any fibers present on it. Again, with the polyester shirt, no fibers were ever transferred to the terminals with that particular experiment.
But you also closely observed the damage that the taser caused to a shirt just like Officer Slager's.
Yes, sir. And in that damage, I found that the taser caused microscopic holes that were created by the melting of fibers together to create a void in the fabric.
Penny, what's been marked for ID only is States 254. Could you take a few moments to flip through that?
Yes, sir.
And are those photographs?
They are photographs.
And what do they depict?
On each one of those, the top one depicts a photograph of the test shirt under white light. The middle photograph is one using an IR source, and then the bottom photograph is one that I actually took using my microscope.
Okay. And are those fair and accurate portrayals of the type of damage you were just discussing that a drive stun of different lengths causes to a shirt just like Officer Slager?
For a period of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 seconds, yes.
Your Honor, at this point, the state would offer States 254 into evidence, I believe, with objection.
Yes, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll give you a break. If you'll go to the jury room, please do not discuss the case. All right, if everyone will be seated. Is there an objection to the exhibit?
Yes.
All right.
The scientific analysis was done in a broad spectrum of testing beyond the facts of this particular case. So in the scientist analysis, she did broad spectrum of tests, several which have no relevancy to this case. By that I mean, this appears to be testing that was done with the cartridge in the taser at the time that it was tested. There's no evidence that a cartridge was present in the taser at the time of the time of the fight. There's also testing that the scientists did by putting different conductive materials under the fiber at the time that the testing was done. So it's a very thorough test and a lot of variables, not many of which are peculiar to the evidence in this case. So we would object to the introduction unless it's being done with thoroughness, which we don't object to, but to insinuate that these tests in any way replicate the evidence in this case is a misleading statement. And that for therefore we object.
All right. Yes, sir, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Judge. These photographs depict, you can drive stun with a cartridge or no cartridge, but these photographs depict 1 second interval tases up to 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 with and without a cartridge. Removing the ones that were done with the cartridge, I'm fine to do that pursuant to their objections. But obviously, what the evidence shows here is what we're debating. What we're using these for is to show that we see here in these experiments done by someone they've qualified as an expert in this field. In these experiments, we see the type of damage that a drive stun tase causes the shirt, just like Officer Slager's. And we're going to elicit from his witness that this type of damage was not found. It is of course, relevant because it's the exact contradiction to the evidence that they put up, that these melted fibers that they have found are consistent with the taser. We're using this evidence to show that the damage is not consistent with the taser. And I believe the witness, as she testified, says she can't testify that the melted fibers, whether or not the melted fibers came from the taser. So I think this is very probative. The experiment was done at different intervals precisely to show, because neither side knows. I mean, of course, it's up to debate whether Mr. Slager was ever tased, but neither side knows for how long or for how long they came in contact. And this evidence is highly probative, and that I believe it will reflect that it wasn't for an interval of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 seconds. And certainly the points Mr. Savage raises are open in cross-examination, but they're cross-examination, not admissibility. Wait, not admissibility. And again, Your Honor, as to the ones done with the cartridge in, it's been asserted by the defense several times that Mr. Slager's memory is flawed, can't be trusted. So we don't, because the evidence is in debate what exactly happened out there, we think all of these photographs are shows there isn't anything consistent markings on the shirt that he had on.
All right, and anything further?
Well, I don't think Mr. Slager, we could agree with that Mr. Slager wasn't wearing a frying pan under his shirt.
I can admit that. That is half of one photograph. And that was just done as a baseline for the experiment. I'll make sure that's covered up in the exhibit on our next break. For your honor's edification, one half of one picture was done with a conductive surface behind it, and I agree, that's not really relevant to what we're discussing. I'll omit that from the exhibit.
All right, if you'll pull that off then. Admit it. Anything further on this point?
Well, we asked that a foundation be made by the solicitor before introducing this to ensure that the experiments were done in the condition in which the shirt was found on April 4th, which would require a understanding of what was being worn underneath the shirt by Mr. Slager in order to give a proper comparison.
All right. If I can see the exhibits that you're proposing to introduce. All right. We'll take a recess for about 5 minutes. And you may step down. Please do not discuss your testimony.